What if the earth was never as empty as the textbooks insisted? What if beneath every beginning humanity has written for itself, another older beginning still breathes, buried but not entirely erased? On certain quiet nights, the question feels less like a thought and more like a distant echo, a sound travelling from a time when names had not yet hardened around things, when the borders between memory and silence were still soft. So before the body sinks completely into this comfort, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in these words invites you to stay, and if you wish, share where you're listening from and the hour of your night so that all these small lights drifting through the same darkness might recognize one another for a moment. History, as it is most often told, prefers a clean staircase. First survival, then gathering, then the slow taming of plants, then the village, then the temple, then the city, then the king, then the scribe, then the archive. Each step neat, each step explained, each step rising obediently toward the present. It is a comforting architecture. It places the listener at the top of the climb, looking down a flight of well-lit stairs, every landing labelled, every shadow accounted for. And yet, the deeper one looks into the soil, the less the past behaves like a staircase at all. It begins to resemble something stranger, a flooded landscape after the fog has lifted, where only certain hills remain visible, while everything between them rests beneath water no eye can pierce. The unease begins quietly. It does not arrive with thunder. It arrives with a stone that appears in the wrong place, a symbol that seems too early, a structure whose geometry implies planning in an age when planning was supposedly unknown, a fragment that is not loud enough to overturn anything, yet stubborn enough to refuse disappearance. Such fragments do not announce themselves as revelations. They simply will not fit, and in their refusal they begin to make the familiar story porous. Through the small cracks they open, something cold drifts in. Not certainty, but the colder thing behind it. The suspicion that some chapters are missing not because they never existed, but because they fell outside the frame in which later ages agreed to recognize the past. For most of modern memory, it was almost taken for granted that monumental architecture, ritual centers, and dense symbolic life could only emerge once agriculture, storage, and hierarchy had been firmly established. First the harvest, then the temple. First the granary, then the priest. The order seemed self-evident, almost a law of social gravity. And then certain places came to light whose mere existence made that order tremble, not because they offered proof of some lost super-civilization, glittering and complete, but because they did something quieter and harder to dismiss. They suggested that humans had been capable of complex shared imagination far earlier than the timeline allowed. They suggested that the inner life of the earliest peoples may already have been thick with meaning, while the textbook still pictured them as little more than survivors flickering between hunger and weather. If that is true, even partially true, then it is not just a date that shifts. The very portrait of the human being shifts with it. What is older, the bread or the gaze toward the sky? The full storehouse, or the need to gather in a particular place and look together at something invisible? The question carries a strange resonance. It touches something deeper than chronology. It touches the suspicion that community itself may not have begun with secured food, but with shared awe, shared fear, shared remembrance of something that could not be touched. And if that is so, then the human creature was perhaps never as simple at the beginning as the tidy stories prefer to imagine. There is also another quiet partner in this great forgetting, one less spoken of than fire or war. The earth itself does not preserve evenly. It is not a careful archive. It swallows, deforms, floods, buries, and rewrites. Coastlines disappear. Rivers shift their beds. Forests grow over paths that were once walked daily. Whole landscapes that were habitable during colder epochs now lie beneath the sea. It is a strange thought to carry into the night, that the maps of the present do not only show where things are, they also mark, without saying so, the exact lines beneath which memory has already drowned. So a slow and uncomfortable possibility begins to take shape. Perhaps the early human story is not merely being expanded by new finds. Perhaps it has always been told from a stage where most of the actual setting was already gone. Not every lost world is mystical. Some are simply geologically lost. The seas rose at the end of the last ice age. Coastal plains, river deltas, lagoons, precisely the places where people most loved to settle, were swallowed. How many traces lie under those waters? No one truly knows, and it is exactly that not knowing that has weight. It is no fantasy to say that the ocean conceals one of the largest blank spaces in human history. But water is not the only force that arranges silence. Power, too, decides what is remembered. Empires gather and discard. Faiths reinterpret. Schools simplify. Archives burn. Languages die, and with them whole keys to symbols whose meaning is now forever locked. What is later taught as the origin is sometimes not the true beginning at all, but only the oldest point from which a culture is still able to recognize itself in the mirror of its own making. Beyond that point lies something else. Perhaps not a single hidden empire, perhaps not a vanished golden age, but a deeper, more fragile prehistory, scattered across continents, broken into fragments, surfacing only in small disturbances. It is in those disturbances that the journey begins, not with a triumphant claim, but with a soft unease, the feeling of standing at the surface of a very old door and noticing only now that it was never fully closed. Beneath what humans call their beginning, something else may quietly rest. Not an answer, not a single key, only the suggestion that the earth is not silent because it is empty, but because it holds far more than it can release at once. And tonight, perhaps, somewhere beneath the soil of memory itself, one small hinge has begun, almost imperceptibly, to move. There is a hill in southeastern Anatolia that should not, by the older logic of history, exist at all. It rises gently from the dry land near the modern city of Sanliurfa, unremarkable at first glance, the kind of swelling in the earth a traveller might pass without a second thought. For thousands of years that is precisely what happened. Shepherds crossed it, wind reshaped it, the local name Göbekli Tepe, meaning something close to Potbelly Hill, or it has carried no hint of what slept beneath the dust. And yet when the soil was finally turned, the staircase of human development began to wobble on its own foundations. Stones emerged that had been carved when, according to every comfortable schedule, no one was supposed to be carving anything at all. The dates themselves carry a strange weight. The oldest layers reach back roughly 11,600 years into a moment when agriculture, in any settled sense, had barely begun to whisper its first experiments. Domesticated grains were not yet feeding villages. Pottery, in the regions that would later define the Neolithic, had not yet been imagined. And yet on that hill T-shaped pillars were being shaped from limestone, some of them rising to nearly 6 meters, some weighing as much as 10 or 20 tons. They were arranged in circles. They were anchored deliberately into prepared bedrock. They were carved with reliefs of foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, wild boars, lions, animals chosen, it seems, with intention rather than accident, as though each creature carried a meaning that the people raising the stones could read at a glance. To imagine the labour required is to imagine an unfinished sentence the textbook never wanted to begin. What kind of community could pull stones of that mass across the landscape? Lift them upright? set them in carefully measured arrangements, and return generation after generation to maintain and rework them. Such a task implies far more than the wandering bands often pictured at the edge of the Ice Age. It implies coordination, shared purpose, sustained memory, the ability to feed many workers without yet possessing fields. It implies, in other words, a society organized around something that was not yet a kingdom and not yet a city, but already, undeniably, a shared imagination dense enough to move mountains in slow motion. The discomfort lies precisely there. For more than a century, the dominant narrative had insisted that monumental ritual centres must follow the rise of agriculture, not precede it. First the surplus, then the priesthood. First the storehouse, then the temple. Göbekli Tepe stood among the dry hills like a quiet correction, suggesting that perhaps the order had been read backward all along. The German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who oversaw the excavations from the mid-1990s until his sudden death in 2014, often described the site in language that surprised his colleagues. He spoke of it less as a settlement than as a sanctuary, perhaps even a kind of pilgrimage place to which scattered hunter-gatherer groups returned across great distances, drawn not by the promise of grain but by something less tangible. Whether his interpretation was complete or only one possible reading, it carried a provocation that has not faded. If people gathered around an idea before they gathered around a granary, then the architecture of belief might be older than the architecture of survival. The temple, in some quiet sense, may have come before the field, and if that is true, then much of what is told about the human origin needs to be unlearned gently, layer by layer. There is another detail that lingers in the mind long after the photographs are closed. At a certain point in their use, several of the great circles were not simply abandoned to ruin, they were deliberately filled in. Earth and rubble were heaped over the pillars, sealing them away, as though the people who had once raised these stones had also decided, at some moment lost to record, that they should be returned to the soil. The act does not look like destruction in anger. It looks like a closing gesture, almost ceremonial, the careful folding of a letter that should not be read aloud anymore. What was being preserved? What was being set aside? The stones do not say. They only carry the strange weight of a place that was both built with enormous effort and buried with equal care. And the more one studies the carvings, the harder it becomes to dismiss them as mere decoration. Animals appear repeatedly across different pillars in patterns that seem to follow some inner grammar. Some figures are paired with abstract symbols whose meaning has been lost so completely that even the most careful scholars only offer guesses. A few researchers have suggested that certain combinations may correspond to constellations as they would have appeared in the night sky thousands of years ago, as though the pillars were not only ritual objects but also a kind of stone memory of the heavens. Other interpretations remain more cautious, reading the imagery as totemic, mythic, or cosmological in ways that resist modern translation. Whatever the truth, one impression is difficult to shake. The people who carved these creatures were not merely surviving, they were already living inside a layered world of meaning, where animals were not just prey or threat but participants in some larger order that humans felt the need to render permanent in stone. Such a thought reframes the older portrait of the hunter-gatherer, the figure so often imagined as a creature of pure instinct, walking thinly across an empty land. Behind the pillars of that hill stands a different image, communities capable of organizing labor on a monumental scale, of holding shared symbolic systems across generations, of choosing certain places as sacred and treating those choices with the seriousness of architecture. None of this requires inventing a lost super-civilization gleaming with hidden technologies. It requires only the harder, quieter admission that the earliest peoples were never as small in spirit as the staircase model suggested. They were in some way that still resists full recovery, already deep. And so a different question begins to surface beneath the hill. If a sanctuary of this scale existed at the very threshold of the Neolithic, what came before it? No structure of such complexity emerges from nothing. Skills must have been refined elsewhere, perhaps over thousands of years, in places that did not survive in stone. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe do not feel like a beginning. They feel like a culmination of something whose earlier chapters are missing. A peak whose foothills lie beneath erosion, beneath flooded coastlines, beneath the silence of materials too soft to last. A masterpiece does not appear in the first moment of an artist's life. It appears after long unseen practice. Why should the labour of an entire culture be any different? Perhaps that is the most unsettling gift of this place. It does not offer a final answer. It offers a deeper doorway. Behind the standing stones, the air grows colder. Somewhere further back beyond the visible circle, other circles may have stood and crumbled. Other gatherings may have whispered their meanings into wind that carried no record. The hill speaks softly, but its silence is the kind that does not feel empty, only patient, the way a memory waits to be remembered by someone who has not yet learned how to listen. A monument can be argued with for centuries. Its stones can be reinterpreted, its dating refined, its meaning dressed and undressed by every passing school of thought. But a footprint is a different kind of witness. It does not announce itself. It does not pose. It does not seek to convince anyone of anything. It is simply the residue of a single unrepeatable moment, when warm skin met soft ground and the ground happened to remember, and when such a quiet thing turns out to be far older than the official map of human movement allowed, it does not so much overturn history as quietly embarrass it. In the white gypsum dunes of New Mexico, in a place that has known the slow, deliberate breath of geology for far longer than any nation, a series of footprints emerged from the sediment around the edges of an ancient lake bed. They were small and large, hurried and slow, the prints of children running, of adults perhaps watching, of a procession of bodies passing across a landscape that, at the time, was very much alive with megafauna. The marks were not striking in themselves. The desert hides many things. What was striking, almost vertiginous, was the date the surrounding seeds returned. Layers of crushed aquatic plant material, sealed above and below the footprints, were measured at roughly 21 to 23,000 years old. If those dates hold, and they've been retested with multiple methods, then human beings were walking that lake's edge during the deepest cold of the last ice age, many thousands of years before the corridor through the North American ice sheets was supposed to have opened. For most of the 20th century, the ruling story of how humans entered the Americas was told with surprising firmness. People crossed from Siberia into Alaska, across the exposed land bridge of Beringia, and then waited, the narrative said, until a passage between the great ice sheets allowed them to descend into the continent. The earliest accepted culture, named for the distinctive fluted stone points found near Clovis, New Mexico, was placed at around 13,000 years ago. The Clovis first model was not a wild claim. It rested on real evidence and decades of meticulous work. But over time it hardened into something heavier than evidence. It became an unspoken boundary, the shape of what could be imagined. Anything older was treated almost reflexively as a mistake of measurement, a contamination, a misread layer. Researchers who suggested otherwise often paid a price in reputation that had nothing to do with the quality of their data, and yet the cracks kept appearing. Sites in Chile, particularly Monteverde, kept returning dates older than the model allowed. Stone tools surfaced beneath supposedly clean Clovis horizons. Coprolites in Oregon's Paisley Caves preserved human DNA in strata too old to fit. Each finding alone could be argued away. Together, they began to feel like a quiet but persistent knocking on a door that the discipline had decided was sealed. The footprints in the gypsum simply walked through that door without asking permission. They did not need to argue. They did not need to publish. They'd already been there for more than 20 millennia, waiting for someone to notice. Even more provocative is a much older bone bed in Southern California, where in the early 1990s construction workers uncovered the broken remains of a mastodon embedded with stones that some researchers later interpreted as hammerstones and anvils. The fragments showed patterns of percussion fracture that, when reanalyzed in the 2010s, were dated to approximately 130,000 years ago. The interpretation remains fiercely contested. Many scholars argue the breakage could be explained by natural processes, by heavy machinery during excavation, or by a confluence of taphonomic accidents. The original team holds that the patterns are too specific to dismiss. The Ceruti Mastodon site, as it came to be known, sits in a strange limbo, neither accepted as evidence of human presence in North America at such impossible depth, nor fully laid to rest. It is the kind of disturbance that does not need to be true in order to matter. Its mere existence as a serious scientific debate quietly reveals how much room for surprise the supposedly settled story still contains. There is something almost humbling about how the earliest humans seem to keep slipping out of the categories built for them. The figure once imagined as a hesitant wanderer at the very margins of the inhabitable world keeps reappearing in places he was not supposed to reach. At times he was not supposed to have arrived. Genetic studies trace ancient migrations across improbable distances. Coastal route hypotheses suggest that early peoples may have moved southward, along the Pacific shoreline of the Americas long before the inland corridor opened, using boats, intimate knowledge of marine resources, and a flexibility that seasonal life on a moving coast required. The shoreline they would have followed is now, of course, mostly underwater, drowned by the same post-glacial rise of the seas that swallowed so many coastal worlds across the planet. The very route along which they may have arrived has been quietly erased by the ocean it crossed. What appears then is not a slow, hesitant species inching reluctantly into new lands. It is something more agile, more curious, more cunning. A creature already capable of reading landscapes, calculating risks, finding edges where ice met water and water met life, and stepping across them not in panic but in a kind of practiced boldness. The intelligence of survival in unstable terrain is not the same intelligence that builds cities. It does not leave behind monuments. It leaves behind the small, almost invisible signature of presence. A chipped stone, a fire-cracked rock, a single line of footprints across a vanished lake. And precisely because such signatures are so easy to miss, they may have been missed by the millions across landscapes that never came under serious survey. What does it mean then to call a continent first inhabited at a particular date? Perhaps it means only the earliest moment that present methods can confirm with sufficient evidence. Perhaps it means only the earliest layer that was lucky enough to survive in a form modern hands know how to read. Behind that confirmed date, other moments may have existed, smaller, quieter, scattered too thinly across time to leave a coherent trail. A handful of people pass through a valley once, then never return. A river changes course and erases the camp they left behind. A coastal community thrives for generations and then watches its world disappear beneath the rising tide, taking with it every artifact, every grave, every story that might have answered later questions. And so the footprints in the gypsum become something more than a discovery. They become a quiet rebuke to the confidence of any timeline that imagines itself complete. Somewhere out there, in a layer not yet exposed, Perhaps already walked over by countless modern feet, other prints may rest, older still, deeper still, more inconvenient still. They're not asking to be found, they simply exist, suspended in their patient stillness, the way only forgotten things can. And the strange thought arrives just before sleep that the earliest evidence of a human being is not a temple, not a tool, not a bone, but the soft moment when someone long ago stepped into wet earth and unknowingly left a message that no one would understand for thousands of generations. If a footprint says only that someone was there, an image at the back of a cave says something far stranger. It says that someone, having survived the day, having eaten and slept and outlived the cold, then chose to crawl into the dark with a small flame and place a mark upon stone that no daylight would ever reach. There is no practical reason for such a gesture. It does not feed the body. It does not sharpen a weapon. It does not warm the night. And yet, across continents and across tens of thousands of years, human beings kept doing it with a quiet, almost unbearable consistency, as though the act itself were the payment for being alive. For a long time, the prevailing assumption held that art, like architecture, was a late blossom of human history, a luxury permitted only after the more urgent business of survival had been settled. The first painters were imagined as relatively recent figures, perhaps 30 or 35,000 years ago, working at the threshold of the modern mind. And then, one by one, the dates began to slide backward. In the Chauvet cave in southern France, lions and rhinoceroses and horses surged across limestone walls in compositions so confident that early scholars assumed they must be the work of much later hands. Radiocarbon dating returned figures of more than 30,000 years, and in some panels approaching 36,000. The artists were not novices fumbling toward representation. They already knew, with terrible certainty, how a lion's shoulder turns as it stalks, how a herd shifts when one animal lifts its head. The mind that drew them was not a beginning. It was an inheritance. Then came the harder shifts. In the limestone caves of El Castillo in northern Spain, uranium thorium, dating of the calcite crusts that had grown over certain hand stencils, suggested ages reaching back beyond 40,000 years. On the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia, paintings of pigs and hand stencils returned even older dates, with one particular figure of a warty pig, recently studied, dated to at least 45,000 years. Some panels in the same region appear to depict therianthropic figures, beings part human, part animal, engaged in scenes that resemble hunts. If these readings hold, then the earliest known narrative scene in human art was painted not in Europe at all, but in Southeast Asia, by people who already understood that an image could tell a story, that figures could relate to one another, that a wall could become a kind of stage. Such a quiet earthquake reshapes the inner geography of the species. Symbolic thought, the capacity to make one thing stand for another, the willingness to spend hours in darkness creating something whose only audience would be other minds. None of these are simple skills. They imply language sophisticated enough to carry shared meaning. They imply abstraction, the ability to hold a concept in the mind and translate it into form. They imply, in some sense, the existence of an inner life so developed that it had already begun to overflow the boundaries of practical survival. And if all of that was already present 45,000 years ago, perhaps far earlier, then what is being witnessed in these caves is not the birth of the human spirit, but a relatively late chapter of a story whose opening pages may be lost forever. Even more haunting are the marks that resist easy interpretation. Across many decorated caves, alongside the recognizable animals, there are abstract signs, dots, lines, crosshatches, ladder-like grids, geometric figures that recur with surprising consistency from site to site. Some researchers have proposed that these signs may form a kind of proto-symbolic system, perhaps even an early stage of graphic communication that preceded writing by tens of thousands of years. Others remain skeptical, cautioning that the apparent patterns may be coincidental, or that the human mind is simply prone to finding order where none was intended. And yet the regularity is hard to ignore. The same shapes appear in caves separated by hundreds of kilometers, sometimes by thousands. If they were merely accidental, why would they recur with such persistent grammar? If they meant something, what? Perhaps the most quietly devastating images of all are the simplest. The hand stencils, a palm pressed against the stone, pigment blown around it through a hollow bone or reed, leaving a soft outline where the skin had been. There is something almost unbearable about them, encountered in the silence of a cave many millennia later. They do not depict anything beyond themselves. They do not symbolize gods or seasons or kings. They say only, "Here is my hand, this exists, I was here." The simplicity is what makes them strike so deeply. Among them are the smaller hands of children and occasionally hands marked by missing fingers, the cause of which remains debated. Frostbite, ritual amputation, sign language, illness, no one truly knows. Whatever the explanation, the gesture itself is recognizable across 40,000 years of distance. To press one's hand against a wall and want it to be remembered is not a primitive instinct. It is one of the oldest threads of self-awareness, still pulling at the same place in the chest. It becomes harder, after sitting with such images, to maintain the older portrait of the early human as a creature occupied solely with food and danger. The cave painters were not living between hunger and weather. They were living between hunger, weather, and meaning. They had already learned, somewhere in the long descent of generations, to organize the world into figures, not only to see the bison, but to see the idea of the bison, and to render that idea in pigment ground from ochre and charcoal and animal fat. To do this, they must have spoken at length about what they were doing. They must have argued, agreed, taught one another, passed knowledge across generations. The cave is silent now, but it was once full of voices. And here a colder thought arrives. If symbolic thought was already so deeply present 40,000 years ago, what was happening in the 80,000 or 100,000 years before that? The fossils of anatomically modern humans reach back 200,000 years and beyond, with newer evidence at sites such as Jebel Irhoud in Morocco extending the lineage further still. For most of that vast stretch, no painted caves remain to testify. Either the art was made in places that did not survive, on bark, on hide, on wood, on the soft surfaces of dunes and riverbanks, or earlier expressions took forms entirely unfamiliar to the modern eye. Either way, the silence is not proof of absence. It is only the silence that survival forced upon the perishable. Perhaps that is the deeper unease of these old images. They're not the beginning of human imagination. They are the earliest fragments fortunate enough to outlast time. Behind them, in the long dark, an immeasurable interior history has almost certainly been lost. Songs, stories, dances, meanings, ways of seeing the world that were never carved or pressed or smoked into stone. Whatever was here before the first surviving image, whatever inner architecture allowed someone to walk into a black cavern and consciously give form to a memory, must have been growing for an age that no calendar can hold. And somewhere in that vanished interior, the species first learned to do the strangest thing it has ever done, to look at the world and to want it to mean something more than itself. There is a particular kind of silence beneath water that even the most patient archaeologist cannot fully break. It is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of presence kept just out of reach. Stone walls, hearths, fishing weirs, the bones of those who once lived along a coast. They may all still be there, suspended in cold dark below the waves, perfectly preserved in their refusal to be examined. The sea did not destroy them. It only closed over them, the way a hand closes around something it does not yet wish to give back. And whoever wishes to imagine the early human story honestly must first accept that an enormous portion of its setting now lies under salt water, beyond the reach of ordinary memory. At the height of the last glacial period, perhaps 20,000 years ago, the world's seas stood as much as 120 meters lower than they do today. The continents had different shoulders. Coastlines reached far beyond their current edges. Whole shelves of habitable land that are now submerged were once dry plains, river valleys, marshlands, lagoons, exactly the kinds of mixed resource environments where human beings have always preferred to settle. Then, as the ice began its long retreat, the meltwater returned to the oceans in surges that lasted thousands of years. The rise was not gentle. Periods of relative calm were broken by accelerations, by sudden centuries of more rapid change, by abrupt floodings that, even when measured by geological standards, must have felt to those living through them like the slow drowning of the world. Between Britain and continental Europe, beneath the cold grey of the modern North Sea, lies the lost country that researchers came to call Doggerland. It was not a marginal place. It was a vast lowland drained by ancient rivers, populated with red deer, aurochs, mammoth in earlier phases, and waterfowl in numbers difficult to imagine. Mesolithic peoples lived there, hunted there, fished there, buried their dead there. Trawlers across the past century have repeatedly hauled up bone harpoons, worked flints, and the occasional human nationally remains from the seabed, fragments of a world that was once a living community of forests, rivers, and shore. Then, gradually, then suddenly, the sea took it. By around 8,000 years ago, much of Doggerland was gone, with a final catastrophic event, the Storegga submarine landslide off the Norwegian coast, sending a tsunami across what remained, sealing the lowland under salt water for good. Whatever oral memory of that loss might have lingered, it long ago dissolved into vague echoes carried by descendants who themselves eventually forgot what their grandparents had wept for. Across the world, on the other side of the equator, an even larger disappearance was unfolding in slow motion. Where the islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines now scatter across the Coral Triangle, there once stretched a great extension of the Asian continent known to geologists as Sundaland. It connected Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and many smaller islands into a single landmass crossed by river systems whose drowned channels can still be traced on the seabed today. For tens of thousands of years, this was one of the most ecologically rich regions on the planet, and human populations there were not late arrivals. The earliest modern humans seem to have moved through this archipelago as early as 60 or 70,000 years ago, perhaps earlier still. Whatever they built, whatever they remembered, whatever shrines or gathering places or burial grounds they shaped, along the coasts of that vast lost land, has lain since the post-glacial flooding beneath shallow seas that have only begun, in recent decades, to be seriously surveyed. It is no accident that the most evocative myths of vanished homelands seem to cluster precisely along these once flooded edges. The Indian Ocean carries memories of submerged kingdoms in Tamil traditions speaking of Kumari Kandam. The waters of Polynesia preserve fragments of older lands now lost beneath the waves. The Mediterranean and Black Sea regions remember floods that overwhelmed older worlds. In the late 1990s, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed, on the basis of underwater sediment cores, that the Black Sea itself had been a freshwater lake until rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosphorus around 7,500 years ago, drowning a productive shoreline beneath hundreds of feet of new sea in a relatively brief geological span. The hypothesis remains debated in its details, but the underlying picture is no longer in dispute. Vast inhabited zones did vanish, and the people who lived through their disappearance must have carried something of that experience into the stories their descendants later told, around fires they no longer recognized as the fires of survivors. What kind of cultures might have flourished along these drowned coasts? It is a question without a comfortable answer. The temptation to imagine sunken cities of crystal towers and forgotten technologies is strong, and it has filled many books and many fantasies. But the more sober possibility is, in some ways, even more haunting. The communities whose homes are now beneath water need not have been spectacular by the standards of later monumental civilizations. They may have been gatherings of fishers, gatherers, navigators, ritual specialists. They may have built in wood, reed, hide, packed earth, materials that leave little trace once submerged. Their richness may not have lain in towers but in networks, of seasonal returns, of trade in shells and pigments, of marriage ties between distant shores, of chanted knowledge passed from elder to apprentice. Such a richness can sustain a complex world for thousands of years and yet vanish, when the waters come, almost without leaving a single object that a later age would recognize as the remains of a civilization. The drowning of these coasts, then, did not merely take houses, it took relationships, languages, oral histories, methods of star reckoning developed for shorelines that no longer exist, ritual calendars tuned to seasonal patterns that the rising sea rearranged forever. It is conceivable, even likely, that some of the most refined early human knowledge about water, weather, and the slow movements of celestial bodies developed precisely in those low coastal zones, and that much of it was lost not because the people died, but because their world dissolved beneath them and forced their descendants into landscapes for which the inherited knowledge no longer fit. A people can survive a flood and still lose their civilization if the flood erases the very environment to which their wisdom was tuned. That is perhaps the quietest, most unsettling part of the picture. Beneath today's seas, beyond the reach of routine excavation, there are likely thousands of sites that record the ordinary, daily, persistent human presence along coast during the deepest stretches of prehistory. Some of these sites may eventually be reached by underwater archaeology. Most never will. They will simply sit, layer upon layer, while currents move slowly above them and surface ships pass overhead carrying passengers who have never heard of Doggerland, of Sunderland, of the drowned plains that fed their distant ancestors. And if it is true that the deepest chapters of human prehistory played out along edges of land that no longer exist, then any history that pretends to be complete is in some quiet structural way already false. The truest map of the human past would have to include not only what the land remembers, but also the long, patient outline of everything the rising water has chosen to keep for itself. The drowning of the coast did not happen in a single smooth exhale. The melt of the great ice sheets stretched across thousands of years, but inside that long arc the climate did something stranger than a simple warming. It shuddered. It hesitated. At one point after the world had already begun to thaw, after forests had begun to advance northward and animals had begun to retrace ancestral roots, the cold returned with unexpected force, as if some old hand had reached back across the threshold to close a door that the warmth had been opening. For more than 1,000 years the planet seemed to remember winter again, and the people who lived through that interruption, whoever they were, must have felt that the very earth had broken its promise. Geologists know this episode as the Younger Dryas, It is named, almost gently, for a small Arctic flower whose pollen reappears in northern European sediment cores at exactly the layer where the climate plunged back into glacial conditions. Beginning roughly 12,800 years ago, temperatures in many parts of the northern hemisphere fell sharply, in some regions by perhaps 10 degrees Celsius within decades. Glaciers that had been retreating advanced once more. Forests that had been expanding shrank back. Hunting grounds that had begun to flourish became sparse again. And then, after roughly 1,200 years, the cold released its grip almost as suddenly as it had taken hold, allowing the long warming of our current Holocene epoch to resume. The fingerprint of this event is preserved in remarkable detail in the layered ice of Greenland, where each annual stripe of snowfall carries traces of temperature, dust, and atmospheric chemistry, allowing the rupture to be read almost like the rings of a single enormous tree. The cause of that abrupt return to cold has been debated for decades, and remains, in some respects, unsettled. The most widely accepted explanation involves the release of vast quantities of fresh water into the North Atlantic, perhaps from a sudden draining of the glacial lake agassiz across central North America, disrupting the ocean currents that distribute heat from the equator toward the higher latitudes. When the conveyor belt of the Atlantic stalled, much of the northern hemisphere lost its warming engine, and the climate snapped back towards something closer to the ice age it had so recently left behind. This explanation rests on solid oceanographic and sedimentary evidence, and it remains the standard account in mainstream science. But alongside it, another hypothesis has surfaced repeatedly since the early 2000s, more controversial, more dramatic, and persistently difficult to quiet entirely. A group of researchers, working from sediment layers found across multiple continents, propose that the Younger Dryas may have been triggered, or at least intensified, by a cosmic impact, a fragmenting comet or asteroid striking or air bursting over the northern ice sheets. They pointed to a thin black layer, sometimes called the Younger Dryas boundary layer, in which they reported elevated levels of platinum, microspherules, nanodiamonds, and other materials commonly associated with high-energy impacts. They suggested that such an event could have destabilized the ice, sent vast pulses of meltwater into the oceans, and perhaps ignited widespread wildfires whose soot is also detectable in the same sediments. The hypothesis has been criticized by many specialists, who argue that the evidence is inconsistent, the sampling uneven, and the proposed mechanism unnecessary given the freshwater explanation. And yet, with each round of contestation, new papers continue to appear, new sites are added, new platinum spikes are measured, and the debate refuses to fully die. It sits in that uncomfortable territory where science is neither finished with a question nor able to declare it closed. Whatever the cause, the consequences for those alive at the time would have been profound. Across many regions, the human story passes through the Younger Dryas as if through a narrow gate. In the Levant, the Natufian culture, which had begun to settle in semi-permanent villages and gather wild cereals in unusual abundance during the warm centuries that preceded the cold snap, appears to have fragmented, with many groups returning to more mobile patterns of life. In North America, the so-called Clovis tradition, the very horizon long thought to mark the first culture of the continent, fades from the archaeological record at very nearly the same time, replaced by smaller, more dispersed, more locally varied tool traditions. The mass extinction of large mammals across the Americas, the mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, accelerates dramatically through this same window, the result almost certainly of a complex interplay between climate shock and human pressure, but undeniable in its scale. Whole ecosystems that had formed the daily reality of those who lived alongside them simply cease to exist within a few human lifetimes. It is difficult at this distance to measure what such a rupture meant in the inner life of those who endured it. They had no satellites, no charts, no scientific framework within which to place a sudden cooling that broke decades of trustworthy weather. For them, the climate was not a parameter, it was the visible behavior of the world itself. When the rains shifted, when the herds did not return, when familiar plants no longer grew where they had grown for generations, the people who lived by these patterns must have felt that the order of the world had become strange. Some adapted, some moved, some retraced ancient roots only to find them changed beyond recognition. Some almost certainly did not survive, and those who did survive carried something else into the next age. A memory, however dim, that the earth was capable of breaking its own laws. That memory may not have been preserved as data. It may have been preserved as a feeling, a refrain, a category of story. The recurring presence in many later mythologies of a previous age that ended badly, a world destroyed by water, by fire, by cold, by the displeasure of the heavens, is striking precisely in its persistence. Such tales are easy to dismiss as moral fables, and many of them surely are. But it is also possible that some of them, faintly and at great distance, carry the muffled echo of real ruptures lived through by long-dead ancestors. A culture that endures a catastrophic environmental break does not necessarily forget it. It may transform the experience into a deeper grammar of warning, embedded in stories about previous suns, previous ages, previous worlds that did not last. To later readers, those stories sound like myth. To those who first told them, they may have been the most accurate description of what had happened that words could carry. If something resembling a coherent symbolic culture had begun to emerge in the warming centuries before the Younger Dryas, then the cold returned to find that culture young, fragile, and possibly clustered along precisely the kinds of coastlines and lake shores that the climate itself was about to rearrange. What rose during that brief warmth, and what was reduced or scattered when the cold came back, is a question to which honest answers remain elusive. But the pattern is suggestive. Before the climate broke, something was beginning. After the climate broke, the trail thins, and the long calm of the Holocene, in which all known recorded civilizations have arisen, may not be the natural state of human history at all, but only the most stable interval the species has yet been granted. A quiet pause in a much older rhythm of disturbance, during which everything we now call the past has somehow learned to remember itself. For most of the modern imagination, the great forests of the equatorial belt have stood as the natural opposite of civilization. Dense, humid, ungovernable, swallowing whatever steps too long beneath their canopies. Where the desert preserves and the ice records, the rainforest dissolves, wood rots, cloth disintegrates, bones soften and disappear within a few seasons. Even stone, weathered by relentless rain and patient roots, eventually yields. It seemed almost natural to assume that nothing of lasting consequence could have grown beneath such a roof of leaves, that the peoples who lived there must have moved in small, quiet bands, leaving no more mark on the world than the animals around them. The assumption was so deep it was rarely articulated. It simply lay beneath the maps, where green spaces were left blank, as if the forest itself were a kind of historical absence. Then the eyes of researchers began to lift, and the trees in turn began to lose their secret. From above, equipped with light pulse instruments capable of penetrating the canopy and stripping away vegetation in computational layers, scientists began to see what walking surveys had missed for generations. In the lowland Maya regions of Guatemala, particularly across the Mirador Basin and the vast survey conducted by the Pacunam Consortium, published in the late 2010 S, More than 60,000 previously unknown structures were revealed beneath the forest cover within a single zone. Causeways stretched between cities, defensive walls rimmed centres that had been thought minor, terracing climbed hillsides that, on the ground, appeared to be untouched wilderness. The Maya world, already known to have been complex, suddenly revealed itself to have been even denser, even more interconnected, even more populous than the most generous earlier estimates had supposed. The forest had not been hiding fragments of a civilization. It had been hiding a continent's worth of one. Further south, across the Bolivian Amazon and into the Brazilian state of Acre, another image began to surface from the digital scans. Geometric earthworks, squares, circles, hexagons, complex enclosures, appeared in patterns spanning hundreds of kilometres. Some had been documented earlier, but the full extent only became visible when satellite and LiDAR imagery allowed entire regions to be read at once. These geoglyphs, now numbering in the thousands, date in many cases to between 2,500 and 700 years ago, and they suggest that the Amazon basin was home to organised societies capable of large-scale landscape engineering far earlier and far more widely than the older models permitted. They were not building monumental stone temples in the manner of the Andes or Mesoamerica. They were doing something different. They were shaping the land itself, and the soil began to speak as well. Across vast stretches of the Amazon, researchers had long puzzled over the existence of dark, fertile patches of earth, locally known as terra preta, which differed dramatically from the thin, acidic soils typical of the rainforest. Chemical analysis revealed that these dark earths were not natural. They had been created by humans layer by layer through the careful incorporation of charcoal, bone, ceramic fragments, and organic waste over generations. Some patches cover hundreds of hectares, some are several meters deep. They are in effect vast anthropogenic gardens, intentionally enriched, often persisting in fertility for centuries after the communities that built them had vanished. The Amazon, far from being a pristine wilderness untouched by human hands, was in many places an enormous cultivated landscape. A forest gardened, edited and maintained by societies whose population estimates have been revised upward in some scholarly proposals to many millions of people across the basin before European contact. The implications fold backward through time in disorienting ways. If the rainforest was so densely inhabited and so thoroughly modified by the time the first European chroniclers arrived in the 16th century, then those chroniclers, already devastated by the epidemic diseases their own arrival unleashed, were not seeing an untouched land. They were seeing the aftermath of a collapse. Whole populations had already been decimated by smallpox, measles, and influenza spreading ahead of direct contact, travelling through indigenous trade networks faster than any European could walk. The forest closed over abandoned villages, gardens, fields, and earthworks within a generation or two. By the time the explorers wrote their reports of empty jungle, much of what they walked through was a mourning landscape, the green silence of fallen civilizations, mistaken by their unaccustomed eyes for the natural absence of culture. There is something quietly devastating about that misreading. An entire continent of complex life was first emptied by invisible plagues, then misnamed by the survivors of the conquerors as wilderness, then categorized for centuries by European science as the absence of civilization. The error was not only factual, it was conceptual. It assumed that civilization must mean stone palaces, written records, codified hierarchies expressed in monumental architecture, and that anything which did not match this template must therefore be something less. But complexity, as the rainforest seems to whisper through its earthworks and dark soils, can take other forms. It can live in the relationship between people and land, in the ability to shape an entire ecosystem across generations without erasing it, in the long memory carried by communities who knew their forest the way another civilization knows its libraries. If this is true of the Amazon, it raises a harder question. How many other lost civilizations were not actually lost in the dramatic sense at all, but simply unrecognized because their architecture did not match the criteria the modern observer had been trained to look for? In the highlands of New Guinea, evidence of agricultural systems at Cook Swamp dating back nearly 10,000 years has steadily revised understandings of where agriculture independently arose. In Africa, the great earthen walls of Benin, often cited as among the largest pre-mechanical earthworks ever built, suggest engineering ambition on a scale that older Eurocentric histories quietly downplayed. In Southeast Asia, ancient hydraulic systems hidden beneath later jungle growth at sites such as Angkor reveal cities that organized water on continental scales. Each of these stories shifts the picture in the same direction. The category of civilization, as it has often been used, was too narrow, and so a slow, almost vertiginous rereading takes place. What if the very concept of uncontacted or untouched land has often been a polite name for a landscape whose previous inhabitants had simply been removed, or whose form of culture refused to declare itself in stone? What if entire chapters of the human past had been waiting all along, beneath green roofs that were never empty, marked by terraces and earthworks and engineered soils, which the eye, untrained to see them, simply read as nature? The forest did not hide these things by accident. It hid them by being underestimated. The deeper failure was not in the trees. It was in the framework that decided what could count as the work of human hands. Beneath a few of those canopies, mapping is now beginning to reveal what was lost. Beneath countless others, the work has not yet started, perhaps may never start. And it is a quiet, unsettling thought to carry into the dark, that some of the most populous landscapes in human history may have been the very ones where the modern map still draws nothing at all. Once the eye has been forced to admit that whole civilizations could be hiding in the categories called wilderness, a more uncomfortable suspicion begins to creep along the edges of the mind. If forests had concealed populous worlds, and oceans had drowned ancient coasts, and ice had erased entire chapters of climate history, then how confident could anyone really be about the strange and irregular shapes that occasionally surface elsewhere? Shapes that almost look intentional, almost look engineered, but never quite enough to settle the argument. Some places refuse to commit themselves. They sit on the line between geology and architecture, between accident and design, and the longer one looks at them, the less stable the line itself appears. Off the southern coast of the small Japanese island of Yonaguni, beneath the warm currents of the East China Sea, divers in the mid-1980s noticed a vast formation of stepped stone that did not behave like ordinary seafloor. Its terraces were sharp where they should have been worn. Its corners turned at angles that felt geometric rather than tidal. There were what appeared to be staircases, channels, flat platforms, even a feature resembling a face carved in shallow relief, though the latter remains contested. The marine geologist Masaki Kimura argued that the formation was, at least in part, modified by human hands during a period when the area was still above sea level, perhaps 10,000 years ago. Other geologists, equally serious, insisted that the structure was a natural product of the tectonically stressed sandstone of the region, where layered rock can fracture along startlingly clean plains. The debate has not resolved. Both sides have continued to publish, photograph, model, and disagree. The site remains in that uncomfortable territory where neither final acceptance nor final rejection has been earned, and where the ocean continues to keep most of the answer to itself. Further west, in the highlands of West Java, Another mound that for centuries had been treated as a sacred hill became, in the early 21st century, the focus of a far more intense controversy. Gunung Padang had long been known as the largest megalithic site in Southeast Asia, with terraces of basalt columns arranged across its summit. But a team of Indonesian researchers, led by the geologist Danny Hilman Natawijaya, began to argue in the 2010s that the entire hill was not natural at all, but rather a vast layered construction, a buried pyramidal structure whose deeper levels might extend tens of thousands of years into the past. Their interpretation, supported by ground-penetrating radar surveys and sediment cores, suggested that beneath the visible terraces lay older hidden chambers and constructed layers, with carbon dates from organic material in some of those layers reaching back into the late Pleistocene. The publication of these findings in mainstream academic journals, particularly a 2023 article that proposed ages potentially older than 20,000 years for the deepest construction, generated immediate and forceful pushback. Critics pointed out the difficulty of distinguishing weathered natural columnar basalt from deliberately stacked architecture, the risk that organic carbon dates might reflect natural soils rather than human activity, and the absence of clearly cultural artifacts at the deeper levels. The article was eventually retracted by the journal in 2024 after sustained methodological critique. And yet, even after the retraction, the deeper question lingers. Was Gunung Padang merely a misread mountain, or did the rejection move too quickly, too defensively, against a possibility that mainstream archaeology was not prepared to entertain? Honest minds remain divided. Such cases are difficult precisely because they sit at the intersection of two equally seductive errors. On one side stands the temptation to leap, to declare that any unusual stone formation must be evidence of a forgotten super-civilization, perhaps even one preserved in the flood myths and lost continent stories of antiquity. This temptation has fueled a long popular tradition of speculation, from Ignatius Donnelly's 19th century reconstructions of Atlantis through more recent best-selling proposals of an ancient global culture wiped out at the end of the Ice Age. On the other side stands the equally seductive temptation to dismiss, to assume that any anomaly inconvenient to the established timeline must be the product of misinterpretation, fraud, or wishful thinking, and to treat continued investigation as embarrassing rather than rigorous. Both reflexes are forms of mental comfort. Both relieve the mind of the harder task. To remain open without becoming credulous, to remain skeptical without becoming defensive. The skepticism of mainstream science is not in most cases the result of a conspiracy. It is the legitimate caution of a discipline that has been burned repeatedly by spectacular claims that did not survive scrutiny. The Piltdown Man hoax of the early 20th century, in which a forged hominid skull misled British archaeology for 40 years, left a long shadow over the field. So did countless smaller cases of misdated artifacts, mislabeled strata, and theories that captured the public imagination only to dissolve under closer examination. A culture of careful conservatism in archaeology is not arbitrary. It is the scar tissue of past mistakes. And yet, scar tissue, while protective, can also stiffen. The very habits that prevent the field from chasing every romantic claim can also prevent it from recognizing genuine anomalies when they appear in ways that resemble, on the surface, the discredited claims of the past. What is most striking about controversial sites such as Yonaguni or Gunung Padang is not so much whether any given interpretation is correct, but what the very intensity of the debate reveals about the present moment. The fact that such places provoke years of disagreement, attract international attention, and force entire methodological conversations to occur in public suggests that the question of pre-Holocene complexity has not been settled, only deferred. The stones themselves do not care about the answer. They simply continue to exist, with their dimensions, their angles, their dates, their accompanying soils. It is the watching mind that must decide what to make of them, and it is in that decision that the boundaries between knowledge and longing become most exposed. Perhaps the most useful thing such sites do is not to confirm or deny any specific theory, but to remind every observer that the official map of the past is unfinished. They serve as quiet pressure points, places where the surface of consensus thins enough that something else might be glimpsed beneath it. Some of these places will eventually be reclassified as natural, their human appearance the work of erosion patterns coincidentally aligned with the human eye. Others may yet reveal evidence that demands a recalibration of what early peoples were capable of doing in landscapes the textbooks long pictured as empty. Most will probably remain ambiguous, neither monuments nor mere geology, holding their secret in a long, indifferent silence. And so the question that lingers is not whether these particular sites are exactly what their most enthusiastic defenders claim, nor whether they are entirely the natural curiosities their fiercest critics insist upon. The deeper question is what the existence of such ambiguous places, scattered across continents, beneath waters and beneath jungles, says about the nature of the past itself. That it is not a finished room one walks through, but a corridor whose far walls keep moving, and whose floor occasionally trembles when one stops long enough to listen. Long before the first archaeologist learned to read stratigraphy, long before the first geologist understood the slow rise of the post-glacial seas, the stories were already there. They were told around fires whose ashes have long since blown away, in languages that no longer have living speakers, in ceremonies whose original meanings have been overwritten many times. And yet, across cultures separated by oceans, by mountain ranges, by tens of thousands of years of distinct development, the same strange image keeps returning. Water rises, the world is overwhelmed, a few survive, the age that was ends. The age that follows knows itself as something that came after. The repetition is too persistent to be ignored, but it is also too varied to be reduced to a single explanation. In Mesopotamia, the flood appears in cuneiform tablets that predate the biblical writing of Genesis by more than 1,000 years. The Sumerian story of Ziusudra, the Akkadian of Atrahasis, and most famously the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, all describe a great deluge sent by divine displeasure, a chosen survivor, a vessel filled with living things, a long subsiding of waters, the sending out of birds to test for dry land. The parallels with the later Hebrew flood account are so close that scholarly consensus accepts a shared cultural inheritance from the Mesopotamian floodplain, where catastrophic river floods were a recurring reality, and where memory of the post-glacial inundation of the Persian Gulf may also have left a deep imprint on the regional imagination. Far to the east, in the Vedic traditions of India, the figure of Manu plays a role almost startlingly familiar to the Western reader. Warned by a divine fish of an approaching deluge, Manu builds a great vessel, secures it to the horn of his rescuer, and rides out the destruction of the previous age, becoming the progenitor of the new humanity. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood sent by Zeus to wipe out a degenerate race, repopulating the world by casting stones that become people. In China, the engineer king Yu the Great does not so much survive a flood as tame one, taming chaotic waters that had drowned the early dynasties, an account preserved in the foundational text Shiji. Across the Pacific, indigenous traditions in Australia, in Polynesia, and in many indigenous nations of the Americas carry stories in which an older world is overwhelmed by water and a remnant population begins again. The Hopi speak of a previous age destroyed by floodwaters before this present world emerged. The Maya tradition recorded in the Popol Vuh describes earlier humanities that were unmade and replaced. The Quechua and Aymara peoples of the Andes preserve memories of a sudden inundation that drowned earlier inhabitants and forced the survivors into the high places. It is tempting, when faced with such a chorus, to leap to the simplest possible explanation. There must have been one global flood, the leap insists, and all of these traditions remember it. The literalist reading has appealed to many across the centuries and continues to circulate in popular literature. But the geological record will not support a single universal flood event of the kind imagined in the most literal versions of the story. There is no sedimentary fingerprint of an instantaneous worldwide submergence. What there is, however, is something more complex, more dispersed, and arguably more interesting. A long succession of catastrophic local and regional floodings during the post-glacial era, any one of which would have devastated the cultures inhabiting its shoreline, and any number of which could have left memorial traces that later coalesced into mythic structures. The drowning of Sundaland in Southeast Asia, the inundation of Doggerland in Northern Europe, the proposed catastrophic refilling of the Black Sea basin in the proposal of Ryan and Pittman, the slow disappearance of the Persian Gulf's once dry valley as the Indian Ocean rose, the meltwater pulses that may have flooded entire watersheds in the Americas and Eurasia. Each of these is in its own scale an apocalyptic event for those who lived through it. None of them was global, but to the people standing on a particular shoreline as the waters climbed, the distinction between regional and global must have felt meaningless. Their world was being taken. The stories they passed down did not need to claim a planetary flood. The grief itself was planetary in feel. Mythology, in this sense, does not function as historical chronicle in the modern academic sense. It functions as something older and stranger, a dense, layered language for compressing experience into form. A story about a flood is rarely just about a flood. It is about loss, judgment, the fragility of order, the grief of a survivor's generation, the moral weight of starting again. But to dismiss the historical kernel for that reason would be to misread the way ancient minds preserved memory. The narrative shell carried the experience precisely because it was emotional, mnemonic, ritualized. A bare account of a rising tide would have faded within a few generations. A vivid story of a doomed humanity, a chosen survivor, a vessel, a returning bird, an oath sworn by the surviving god that lasted millennia, because it spoke to something deeper than the event itself. Anthropologists and folklorists have long argued about how to weigh such stories. The comparative mythologist Mircea Eliade saw in flood narratives a recurring structure of cyclical destruction and renewal, a way for traditional cultures to express the rhythm of cosmic time. Others, working from a more historical angle, have proposed that certain widespread mythic motifs may indeed encode genuine prehistoric events, transmitted across generations through oral tradition with surprising stability. Studies of certain Australian Aboriginal traditions, for example, have suggested that some coastal stories accurately preserve geographical features that have been underwater for nearly 10,000 years, since the post-glacial sea level rise, an extraordinary claim that, if even partially correct, implies oral memory operating across timescales most modern minds find difficult to imagine. There is, in this, a quietly sobering possibility. Cultures without writing are often assumed by literate civilizations to be incapable of preserving deep historical memory. But oral tradition, ritually disciplined and woven into the structures of identity, may in fact be a more durable form of recall over very long periods than is commonly admitted. If even fragments of post-glacial flooding events have survived in song and story for thousands of years, then the chorus of flood myths from around the world is not necessarily the same event told many ways, but many different events remembered in their own local detail through a shared symbolic grammar that humans seem to reach for when their world is taken from them. What lingers then is not the question of whether a single great flood once occurred, but the deeper one beneath it. Why did so many human cultures separated so widely choose to remember their early past as something that ended badly? Why is the dominant memory of prehistory in tradition after tradition not one of triumphant ascent, but of catastrophic loss followed by careful rebuilding? Perhaps because that, in fact, is what happened, not once but many times. And perhaps the deepest layer of the human past, lost to archaeology and protected only by myth, is a long inheritance of grief that the species somewhere beneath its modern certainty has never entirely forgotten. If the oldest part of human memory survived in story, then a later, more recent erasure took place in writing. The image of fire consuming a library is one of the most painful symbols a literate civilization can bear, because every burning scroll represents not only a physical loss, but the closing of a door that may never open again. A person dies, but their words once written can outlive empires a library dies, and centuries of conversation between minds across generations fall silent in a single afternoon. Yet such fires were not the only way the world's collective knowledge has been thinned. The slower, quieter erasures, through neglect, through translation, through deliberate selection, may, in the long run, have taken even more from the human inheritance than the dramatic flames the textbooks remember. Of all such losses, none has assumed quite the symbolic power of the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. The exact story of its end is, in fact, less clear than many popular accounts suggest. The library was not destroyed in a single mythic blaze, but eroded across centuries through a combination of accidents and decisions. The fire during Julius Caesar's siege of the city in 48 BCE, which probably consumed warehouses near the harbour, including books awaiting transport. The violent civil unrest under the Emperor Aurelian in the late 3rd century CE. The destruction of the daughter library at the Serapeum during the Christianization of Alexandria under Theophilus in 391 CE. The gradual disappearance of institutional support for pagan learning. By the time of the Arab conquest in the 7th century, the Great Library as a coherent institution had long ceased to exist. What was lost in fragments across these centuries was not merely papyrus and parchment, but entire schools of thought, the mathematical traditions that had built upon Euclid and Archimedes, the geographical work of Eratosthenes who had measured the circumference of the earth, the medical writings of Herophilus and Erasistratus, the lost plays of dramatists known to us only by titles. Whole authors are remembered now only because some later writer happened to quote a single line of theirs in passing. Such losses are devastating, but they're also famous. The losses that received less attention may have been even greater. In the 16th century, on the other side of the world, Bishop Diego de Landa stood in the Yucatan, surrounded by the codices of the Maya. These were folded books, painted on bark paper coated with lime, containing astronomical tables, ritual calendars, historical chronicles, and mythological narratives developed over centuries of intellectual labour. De Landa, who would later write one of the most important early European accounts of Maya culture, ordered these books burned in 1562 at the Auto da Fe of Mani. He recorded the act with brisk satisfaction. The Maya, he wrote, regretted to an amazing degree and caused them great affliction. Of the entire Maya literary tradition, only 4 codices are known to survive today, scattered in museums in Madrid, Dresden, Paris, and a fragment in Mexico City. Whatever else they had recorded, their understanding of time, their cosmology, their dynastic history, the inner architecture of their civilization, vanished within a few hours by the will of one man who believed he was performing a service to his god. In the late 12th century in northern India, the great Buddhist university at Nalanda met a similar end. Founded perhaps in the 5th century CE, Nalanda had grown into one of the largest centres of learning in the world, with a library said to occupy multiple buildings and to hold hundreds of thousands of texts on philosophy, logic, medicine, astronomy and grammar. When the Turkic conqueror Bahtiyar Khalji invaded the region around 1193, the university was sacked and its libraries set on fire. Tibetan accounts written shortly afterward described the burning of texts continuing for months, the buildings smouldering long after the soldiers had moved on. Whatever Buddhist intellectual traditions had been preserved at Nalanda, including many texts whose Sanskrit originals are now known only through Tibetan or Chinese translations made centuries earlier, were largely extinguished in that single campaign. A civilization's accumulated thought of nearly a millennium was carried away in smoke. In Baghdad, in 1258, the Mongol siege under Hulagu Khan ended with the systematic destruction of the House of Wisdom and the libraries of the Abbasid capital. Eyewitnesses reported that so many books were thrown into the Tigris that the river ran black with ink for days. Whether or not such accounts were exaggerated by chroniclers, the underlying loss is undeniable. Centuries of accumulated work in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, including the products of the great translation movement that had preserved and extended Greek, Persian, Indian, and Syriac learning, were drowned, burned, or scattered. The Islamic world's intellectual centre of gravity shifted permanently afterward, and the trajectory of human inquiry was bent in directions that can never be fully recovered. These dramatic burnings are remembered. Other erasures took place so gradually that almost no one noticed. Across the Christianizing Roman Empire of the 4th and 5th centuries, the works of pagan philosophers, scientists, and historians were not always burned. Many simply ceased to be copied. The labour of producing books before the printing press was enormous. Each generation of scribes had to choose what to reproduce, and what was not reproduced disappeared as the existing copies wore out. Theological priorities, institutional preferences, and shifts in fashion determined what survived. Of the writings of Democritus, who proposed atomic theory, almost nothing remains. Of the historical works of Polybius, only fragments. Of the mathematical and astronomical work of countless others, less still. The losses were not always violent. They were sometimes merely the result of nobody choosing year after year to keep them alive. A library does not need to burn to disappear, it only needs to stop being read. There is something even darker in this realization, because it means that loss is not always the work of barbarians or fanatics. It is sometimes the work of orderly institutions making rational decisions about what is worth the cost of preservation. Every archive is a curated archive. Every canon is a selection. Every list of great works is a list of what someone at some point decided should not be allowed to perish. The unspoken corollary is that everything else was permitted to. The history of human thought, then, is not the smooth accumulation of all that has been thought, but the carefully filtered remainder of what successive generations chose to carry forward, and the further back one travels, the heavier that filtering becomes, until what remains from the deepest past is not the body of ancient knowledge, but a few flecks of it, preserved by accidents that even those who saved them could not fully predict. The truly disturbing question, then, is not what was destroyed in the famous fires. It is how much was quietly removed from the human inheritance long before any flame was ever lit. And what kind of past would emerge if all that had been allowed to perish through indifference, copying decisions, and changes of fashion could somehow be returned to the shelves? What shape would the story of the species take if its memory were no longer curated by those who survived to speak last? The destruction of a library is loud, but the rewriting of a god is silent. When the books burn, at least the act announces itself. Ash carries its own evidence, and survivors know what has been taken from them. But when an older deity is renamed rather than destroyed, when a sacred spring is rededicated, when a festival changes its calendar but not its rhythm, the loss happens without smoke. The community continues to gather. The same hilltop is still climbed at the same hour of the year. The faces above the altar have only changed their names. To the descendants, nothing seems to have been lost. Yet something has, and the longer one studies the surface of religious history, the more the unease grows that what is now believed to have always been there was, in many cases, only the most recent occupant of an older sacred place. The phenomenon has many names in different traditions. Anthropologists sometimes call it religious syncretism, the blending of older and newer beliefs into a single living practice. Historians of religion may speak of palimpsest worship, layered devotions, or the absorption of indigenous cults by an incoming faith. The mechanism is rarely a sudden replacement. It is more often a gradual and skillful displacement. The new religion arrives and finds an existing landscape of meaning. Rather than waste centuries trying to extinguish that meaning, it inhabits the same places, the same dates, the same emotional grammars, and quietly substitutes its own figures into the old shapes. The community continues to feel that it is doing what its ancestors did, while the inner identity of what they are doing has shifted by 90 degrees. The pattern is older than any single faith. In the Roman Empire, when Emperor Constantine moved the date of celebrations to align with new theological priorities, the festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, observed near the winter solstice, was gradually overlaid with Christmas. The astronomical fact that gave the older festival its meaning, the moment in late December when the sun, after weeks of seeming retreat, begins again to climb in the sky, did not change. Only the figure honoured at that moment changed. The peasant who lit candles at the darkest point of the year was not necessarily told to abandon his old ritual. He was told that the light he was celebrating now had a different name. Across centuries, the older meaning faded, while the action persisted. By the time anyone thought to ask what had originally been celebrated, almost no one could remember. The same kind of substitution shaped countless local cults. Across the Mediterranean and through northern Europe, Christian missionaries did not always tear down the temples they encountered. Pope Gregory the Great, in a famous letter of 601 CE to the missionary Mellitus travelling to England, instructed that pagan temples should not be destroyed but cleansed and rededicated to the Christian God, so that the people, finding their familiar holy places preserved, would more easily come to worship within them. The strategy was practical. It was also profoundly transformative. The hill that had been sacred to a local goddess of fertility became sacred to a virgin saint who promised intercession. The well that had healed pilgrims through the powers of an older spirit became a holy well dedicated to a martyr whose relics had been placed nearby. The faithful continued to climb the hill, drink from the well, leave offerings, recite prayers. They never noticed, or never spoke of, the fact that the structure of their devotion had been seamlessly slid beneath a new theological canopy. Even more striking are the cases where former gods became, by the same mechanism, the demons of the new religion. Across the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean, deities who had once received reverent worship were demoted, in monotheistic readings, to malevolent powers. The Canaanite god Baal once a thunder deity served in countless temples, became in later biblical literature a synonym for false worship. The fertility goddess Astarte became Astaroth, listed among the demons of medieval grimoires. The horned figures of pre-Christian European spirituality, often associated with forests, animals, and seasonal cycles, were absorbed into the iconography of the Christian devil, complete with horns and cloven feet. The transformation served a clear purpose. It allowed the new faith to dismiss the old not as alternate truth but as deception, while still acknowledging the reality of the old god's power as something to be feared and resisted. In this way, an entire spiritual ecology of the ancient world was preserved precisely as a negative image, its figures still present but reversed in moral polarity. What this kind of erasure leaves behind is something almost more confusing than total destruction. The names persist, but inverted. The places persist, but reassigned. The rhythms persist, but explained differently. A scholar centuries later, encountering the result, sees only the surface and assumes that this surface is the original. They write histories in which the older meanings have been rendered nearly invisible, not because anyone deliberately denied them, but because the new meanings have so thoroughly possessed the spaces in which they once lived. The pre-Christian Europe of the early medieval period, the pre-Islamic Arabia of the 7th century, the pre-Buddhist Tibet, the pre-Christian Andes, the pre-imperial cosmology of China, all of these are reconstructed today only with great difficulty, often by reading the official accounts of those who replaced them and looking carefully at what they revile, fear, or attempt to forbid. The most reliable map to a forgotten religion is sometimes drawn by tracing the contours of what its successor felt the need to suppress. There is a strange irony in this. The faiths that worked hardest to overwrite the older traditions also, in their resistance, preserve them, by mentioning them, by warning against them, by depicting them as adversaries. Without the polemical writings of medieval theologians, modern scholars would know far less about Norse paganism than they do. These surviving records were written largely by Christian observers describing what they were trying to displace. Without Spanish chronicles, written by men who often despised what they described, the inner workings of the Mexica and Inca religious worlds would be even more inaccessible than they already are. Each act of denouncement left, in spite of itself, a faint imprint of the thing denounced. If the gods can be renamed, then perhaps so can entire chapters of human meaning. The deeper the search descends, the harder it becomes to know whether the present-day names of forces, ideas, even of historical events, sit comfortably on top of older identities that have simply been smoothed over. A holiday today may be the polite costume of an older fear. A saint may be the soft inheritor of a far older spirit, retained in everything but explanation. A landscape's holiness may persist for reasons no one in the surrounding villages can any longer articulate, only that something feels right about gathering there at certain times of the year, and perhaps beneath these quiet continuities, the older meanings still listen. They are not lost so much as muffled, their gestures still being performed by hands that no longer remember why. Whatever spiritual archaeology of the human past exists, it must dig downward not only through soil but through liturgy, through nomenclature, through the slow theological accretion of centuries, and it must accept at every level that the names belong to whoever was last, permitted to write them down. If gods can be renamed, then so can entire pasts, and the rewriting of a past is rarely the work of a lone forger sitting in some shadowed chamber. It is far more often the patient labour of an entire political order, undertaken across generations, with each adjustment so small that the people living through it scarcely noticed the line of their inheritance being bent. Empires need origin stories. They need a beginning that flatters their present, and so, again and again, History has been quietly retailored to fit the cut of whichever crown happened to be in power at the moment of writing. What survives in the record is not always what happened, but what those who happened to win permitted to be remembered. The Romans understood this with a clarity that borders on the unsettling. In the late 1st century BCE, as the Republic gave way to the Principate of Augustus, the poet Virgil composed the Aeneid at the emperor's encouragement. The poem traced the lineage of the Roman people, and through them the Julian family, back to Aeneas, a Trojan prince who had escaped the burning of Troy and travelled westward to found, through his descendants, the city on the 7 hills. It was a beautiful work, exquisitely crafted, deeply moving, and it was also transparently an act of political mythography. By tying Augustus to a hero of Homeric epic, the new imperial order acquired a depth of legitimacy that no living memory could grant. Rome was no longer simply a city that had grown by accident through war and trade. It was the fulfillment of a divine promise, woven into the fabric of the universe long before any of its actual inhabitants had drawn breath. The fact that scholars even at the time understood this story to be largely a literary construction did not weaken its grip. Within a few generations, it was simply how the Roman past began. Such constructions are not exceptions in the history of imperial memory. They are closer to the rule. In China, the unification of the warring states under the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, Qin Shi Huang, in 221 BCE, was followed within a few years by one of the most aggressive acts of textual cleansing in the ancient world. According to the historian Sima Qian, writing about a century later, the Chancellor Li Si advised the emperor that the persistence of older histories and competing philosophical traditions was a source of disunity. The remedy was the so-called burning of books and burying of scholars. Records of the older states, with the partial exception of the chronicles of the Qin themselves, were ordered to be destroyed. Privately held texts of the Confucian and other schools were to be surrendered and burned. A purge of intellectuals followed. The scale and historicity of the event have been debated by modern historians, with some arguing that the destruction was less total than later accounts suggested. But the gesture itself, real or exaggerated, established a pattern that would echo across centuries. The new power consolidating its rule by attempting to be the sole curator of the past. Even where there is no public bonfire, the same effect can be achieved by quieter means. The Inca Empire, in the 15th and early 16th centuries, expanded with extraordinary speed across the Andean world, absorbing dozens of distinct peoples with their own histories, languages, and dynastic memories. According to the chronicles of the early Spanish observers, the Inca rulers required conquered peoples to integrate their own oral traditions into the Inca cosmological order, with the Sapa Inca and his ancestors placed at the centre. Local genealogies were not always erased outright, but they were carefully repositioned, made to bend toward the new sun. When the Spanish themselves arrived a few decades later, they encountered Andean peoples who already lived inside an officially curated history shaped by the imperial centre. And over the next centuries, the colonial chroniclers added another layer on top, again rewriting the past to legitimate the new order. By the time European scholars began to take serious interest in pre-Hispanic American history, what they were studying was a story that had been edited at least twice, possibly more, before it ever reached their hands. The pattern is chillingly consistent. A new political centre arises. It needs to anchor itself in time. It encounters, inherits, or conquers older traditions. It rearranges those traditions so that its own emergence appears not as a contingent event, but as the inevitable outcome of a deeper process. Older centres of meaning are demoted to the status of forerunners or rebels or dead ends. The chronology becomes a stage on which the present is the protagonist. And then, because the new centre controls the means of textual production. The scribes, the chroniclers, the official histories, the inscriptions on monuments and coins. Its version becomes the version, until centuries later some careful researcher tries to peel back the layers and finds, beneath them, the worn edges of older versions that disagree. Even modern nation-states, which often imagine themselves to be more transparent and rational than the empires of antiquity, have not been exempt from this process. The construction of national histories in 19th century Europe involved the careful selection of certain ancestors, certain heroic events, certain founding figures, and the equally careful sidelining of episodes that did not fit the desired narrative. Folklore was collected, but selectively. Languages were standardized, often at the expense of regional variants whose continued existence would have complicated the story of national unity. Archaeology was, in many places, mobilized to confirm what the political centre already wished to be true about the depth and continuity of its presence in the land. The result was a series of national pasts, each appearing to its own citizens as the most natural and self-evident of inheritances, but each, on closer inspection, the product of choices about which threads to pull forward and which to allow to fade. This does not mean, of course, that every official history is a deliberate fabrication. Most of the people who participate in the construction of such narratives believe what they are writing. The selectivity operates beneath conscious awareness, expressed as the natural ranking of what is important versus what is marginal, what is central versus what is peripheral, what counts as real history versus what is dismissed as myth or legend or folklore. The very vocabulary of historical analysis carries embedded judgments about which kinds of evidence and which kinds of voices deserve to be taken seriously. A chronicle written by a court scribe in service to a king is treated as a primary source. The oral traditions of the people that king conquered are treated at best as ethnographic data, at worst as quaint stories with no historical content. The hierarchy is so deeply embedded that it took most of the 20th century for serious challenges to it to begin penetrating mainstream scholarship. Imperial chronologies are clean precisely because they have been cleaned. The further one travels back, the more the cleaning has accumulated, and the more difficult it becomes to recover anything resembling what the people actually living in those eras would have called their own past. Whatever lies beneath the smoothed surface of the official record may in the end be unrecoverable in detail, but the awareness that the surface itself is smooth, that someone, repeatedly, polished it, is perhaps the most useful inheritance the modern observer can carry forward. It is a quiet form of vigilance, a refusal to mistake the curated history of the victors for the wider chorus of voices that lived, loved, and were eventually rewritten out of their own age. There is a quieter form of erasure, one that does not involve fire or conquest at all. It operates not through the destruction of evidence, but through the slow narrowing of what evidence the present is able to recognize. Every era of inquiry inherits a certain frame for what counts as serious knowledge, what counts as a meaningful question, what counts as a respectable answer. Within that frame, vast amounts of work can be done. But just outside it, things may be sitting in plain sight for decades, even centuries, waiting for someone to develop the eyes capable of seeing them. The history of science is not only the history of discoveries, it is also the history of how long it took for things already known by a few to be allowed by the many. The story of plate tectonics offers an unusually clear example. In 1912, the German meteorologist Alfred Wegener proposed that the continents had once been joined into a single landmass and had since drifted apart. He pointed to the matching coastlines of South America and Africa, to similar fossils on opposite sides of the Atlantic, to comparable rock formations on shores now separated by thousands of kilometers. The evidence was striking. The hypothesis was, in retrospect, essentially correct. And yet for nearly half a century Wegener's theory was treated by the geological mainstream with a contempt bordering on ridicule. He died in 1930 on an expedition to Greenland with his ideas still relegated to the academic margins. It was not until the 1960s when oceanographic data revealed seafloor spreading and gave a mechanism for continental movement that what Wegener had argued was finally accepted. The continents had been moving the entire time. The evidence had been visible the entire time. What had been missing was not the evidence, but the willingness to see it within the existing frame. The pattern repeats. The Australian physician Barry Marshall in the 1980s proposed that most stomach ulcers were caused by a bacterium, Helicobacter pylori, rather than by stress or diet. The medical establishment dismissed the claim for years. The prevailing model held that no bacterium could survive the acid environment of the stomach. Marshall, frustrated by the resistance, eventually swallowed a culture of the bacterium himself to demonstrate its effects, developing gastritis as a result. The acceptance of his work and the eventual Nobel Prize that followed did not come because new evidence appeared. It came because the field's resistance gradually weakened in the face of accumulating studies. The discovery had been there. The willingness to see it had been delayed. In archaeology, the analogous story is the long resistance to the idea that human beings had been in the Americas before the Clovis culture. Sites such as Monteverde in southern Chile, with dates significantly older than 13,000 years, were dismissed for decades by leading researchers in the field, and those who advocated for them often paid a professional price. The acceptance of pre-Clovis occupation, when it finally came in the 1990s and 2000s, did not erase the years during which careful work had been ignored. The discoveries had been made. The institutional capacity to acknowledge them had simply been slower than the data itself. Such episodes reveal something the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn described in his 1962 work on scientific revolutions. Knowledge, Kuhn argued, does not advance through a smooth accumulation of facts. It advances through long periods of normal science, during which researchers work within an established paradigm, followed by occasional ruptures in which the paradigm itself shifts, often because anomalies that had been quietly building up for years finally become impossible to ignore. The shifts are not merely intellectual. They are sociological, even psychological. New paradigms tend to take root not because the older generation is persuaded, but because the older generation eventually retires, and a younger generation, less invested in the previous orthodoxy, simply finds the new framework more useful. Knowledge advances in part by waiting for its opponents to die. This is a sobering insight when applied to questions about the deep past. If the discipline studying human prehistory has, like every other field, an internal sociology that determines which kinds of claims are taken seriously and which are not, then it follows that the present official picture of the human past is not necessarily the picture that best fits the available evidence. It is the picture that best fits the evidence as filtered through the assumptions, the institutional structures, and the professional incentives of the current generation of scholars. Most of those assumptions are well considered. Many of those institutional structures exist for good reasons. Most of those professional incentives are not corrupt in any obvious sense. And yet, in aggregate, they create a frame, and frames have edges. Outside the edges of the current frame, anomalies may be slowly accumulating, ignored not because they're unimportant, but because no one has yet found a way to discuss them without violating the unspoken rules of what serious researchers are permitted to say. This is why the fierce reactions to certain claims about deep prehistory often reveal as much about the present as they do about the past. When a particular site or hypothesis suggests that human cultural complexity might extend significantly further back than the prevailing model permits, the immediate response is often not careful evaluation but reflexive dismissal. The dismissal is not always wrong. Many such claims do collapse under scrutiny, but the speed and intensity of the rejection is sometimes disproportionate to the evidence at hand, suggesting that what is being defended is not merely a particular conclusion, but a much larger architecture of assumption that the conclusion would, if accepted, force into reconsideration. To accept that complex symbolic life existed 20,000 years earlier than the textbooks say would not be a small adjustment. It would require rewriting major sections of a great many textbooks. The institutional cost of such a revision is high. The institutional incentives to defer it are correspondingly strong. None of this implies a conspiracy. Conspiracies require coordination. The slowness of paradigm shifts is something more diffuse and, in a way, more difficult to address. It is the cumulative effect of thousands of small decisions made by individual researchers acting in good faith within the structures of their field. A graduate student is told that working on certain topics will not lead to a stable career. A journal editor declines to send a controversial paper for review because previous papers on the same theme attracted criticism. A grant committee favours proposals that build incrementally on accepted models. A textbook author chooses in the limited space available to summarise the consensus rather than to dwell on disputes that might confuse undergraduates. Each decision is reasonable on its own terms. The aggregate effect is a steady reinforcement of whatever the current frame happens to be, and a corresponding marginalisation of whatever lies just beyond its edges. What this means for the search for what came before is not that the truth is hidden exactly. It is that the truth, in many cases, may be visible without yet being seen. Some of the evidence for a deeper, more complex, more disrupted human past may already be sitting in published papers, in museum drawers, in the field notes of researchers who never quite knew what to do with what they had found. It may be waiting, like Wegener's continents, for the slow generational change that allows new patterns to be recognized. And the past, indifferent to the schedule of our acceptance, will simply continue to be what it has always been, older, stranger, and more layered than the official map allows, while the map itself is slowly redrawn by hands that often do not realize they have been holding the older version upside down. At a certain point in any honest descent into the human past, a quiet shift occurs in what one is even searching for. The early instinct is to look for the lost civilization, singular and grand, a hidden ancestor whose discovery would explain everything. The popular imagination has hungered for such an ancestor for centuries, naming it Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu, the antediluvian world, the forgotten empire whose collapse seeded the cultures we know. Each of these names carries a particular flavour, but underneath them all lies the same wish, that somewhere beneath the recorded chapters of history, a single more glorious chapter is waiting to be reopened, and that with its rediscovery the entire story would finally make sense. It is a powerful wish, and it may also be the wrong shape of question entirely. The deeper one travels through the layers, the unexpectedly old monuments, the drowned coastlines, the abrupt climate ruptures, the curated archives, the rewritten gods. The less the evidence pulls toward a single hidden empire, and the more it suggests something stranger and harder to name. What if there was never one civilization before us, but many? Not a unified golden age that fell, but a long dispersed succession of smaller orderings, each rising in some particular landscape, lasting for some span of generations, developing its own ways of marking time, organising labour, telling stories, honouring its dead, and then fading, sometimes through catastrophe, sometimes through slow change, sometimes through being absorbed by what came afterward. Not a single lost world, but a chorus of them, scattered across continents and across millennia, each one fully real to those who lived inside it. None of them quite stable enough to leave the kind of unbroken record that later civilizations would learn to call history. In this view, the human past begins to resemble not a tree with one trunk, but a forest with many. Some of those trunks grew tall enough that their fallen forms can still be traced through the soil. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, the great Bronze Age cultures of Eurasia. Others may have grown only briefly, or in regions where the climate erased them quickly, or in materials that did not survive. The Natufian villages of the Levant before the Younger Dryas, the gardeners of the Amazon basin, the builders of Göbekli Tepe and the related sites near Karahan Tepe, the coastal communities along the now drowned Sundaland shelf, the Mesolithic peoples who fished the rivers of vanished Doggerland, the urban planners of Catalhoyuk with their windowless interiors and rooftop streets, the metalworkers of Varna who buried their dead with more gold than the rest of the world possessed put together. Each of these could be considered the visible portion of an experiment in human community. Many of them did not lead directly to anything that came afterward. They were not preparations for the later civilizations. They were themselves complete in their own moment, and then they ended. This shift in framing carries its own quiet humility. It admits that the human story is not a triumphant ascent in which each step was a deliberate preparation for the present, but a long sequence of attempts, some of which lasted, most of which did not. It admits that the present civilization is not the inevitable outcome of a single arc of development, but the temporary continuation of certain experiments that happen to survive long enough to leave durable traces. And it admits, perhaps most uncomfortably, that the criteria by which one judges what counts as a civilization are themselves provisional. A society that does not build in stone, that does not write, that does not assemble visible hierarchies of monumental power, may still possess complex cosmology, sustained intergenerational knowledge, refined social and ecological understanding. By the dominant criteria, such societies vanish from the record of civilization. By any honest accounting of human achievement, they may belong fully within it. The thought reframes even the question of disaster. If there were many small worlds, then the catastrophes of the deep past did not need to wipe out a single great civilization to deprive humanity of much of its inheritance. It would be enough for them to disrupt many small ones. A coastal community in southern Sundaland, whose intricate fishing knowledge had been refined across 200 generations, did not need to be a great empire to lose, when the seas rose, an irreplaceable archive of practical wisdom. A network of pastoralists in the Green Sahara before its desertification did not need to have invented monumental architecture to lose, when the climate shifted, the inner architecture of an entire way of being human. These were not minor losses. They were enormous. They were simply distributed. Many small extinctions of meaning occurring across many landscapes, across many millennia, accumulating into a vast unrecorded sum. There is something almost more haunting in this image than in the older fantasy of a single mythical Atlantis. A single lost super-civilization, however tragic, would at least be a coherent thing. The mosaic possibility is messier and harder to mourn. It does not give the imagination one shining city to weep over. It gives instead an immense and indistinct landscape of vanished gatherings, vanished languages, vanished symbol systems, vanished relationships between humans and the particular places they came to know. Some of those places no longer exist. Some still exist but have forgotten the people who knew them best. Some are still inhabited by descendants of those original peoples who carry fragments of the old knowledge in their stories, in their farming techniques, in their relationships with land and water, but who themselves often live now within frameworks imposed by later orders that have classified their inheritance as folklore. This is also perhaps a more accurate model of how civilizational fragility actually behaves. The collapse of a single great empire is dramatic and visible. The fall of Rome, the abandonment of Maya cities, the dissolution of Bronze Age palatial economies after the late 13th century BCE. Such collapses are studied in detail, mourned, celebrated, debated. But the slower forms of civilizational disappearance, in which a way of life simply dissolves over generations because its environment has changed, or its young people have moved into other forms of community, or the network that once sustained it has been disrupted in ways too gradual to register as a crisis. These are perhaps far more common, far more pervasive, and far less remembered. The dramatic collapses get the histories, the quiet erasures only get the silences. If the deep past is best understood as a chorus of beginnings, rather than a single lost beginning, then the question of what came before us takes on a different texture. It is no longer only a question of finding the missing temple, the missing city, the missing king. It is also a question of asking how many ways of being human have already been tried and lost, in how many landscapes under how many sky, with how many different vocabularies for what mattered. Some of those ways may have been wiser than the present in particular respects. Some may have been crueler. Some may have been simply different in ways that present-day frameworks do not yet have the categories to register. What unites them is only that they came, they lasted for a while, and they passed, leaving the present not as the culmination of a single journey, but as one more living attempt in a much older sequence whose earlier members have, for the most part, dissolved back into a landscape too patient and too old to keep them all in mind. At the far end of any long descent into the deep past, a strange thing happens. The eye that began by looking outward into vanished landscapes and forgotten gatherings slowly turns inward without ever announcing the turn. The questions that were once about them become questions about us. The longing to recover what came before begins to reveal itself as a longing to understand something the present has not yet quite admitted about itself. And the search for what was here before, after passing through stones and footprints and drowned coasts and burned libraries and renamed gods and rewritten chronologies, returns at last as a quiet mirror set up at the edge of the modern self, asking what kind of creature looks for such things and why. There is a particular form of grief that runs beneath this kind of inquiry, though it is rarely named. It is not grief for any specific civilization. It is grief for the structural condition of being a creature whose past is mostly inaccessible, whose memory is mostly curated by accidents and by power, whose own present is, in turn, almost certainly being shaped by losses it does not yet recognize. The modern observer cannot see the early peoples of Sunderland, but neither can the modern observer easily see the things their own present is allowing to slip away. The language is dying every year, the ecological knowledge fading from rural communities, the oral traditions surviving in only one or two elderly speakers, the small sciences and informal disciplines being forgotten, because no one with institutional power has decided to record them. The same forces that have always operated on memory are still operating now. The future will look back at this present moment and see in it the same kind of selective haze that the present sees when it looks at the deep past. This is, in its own way, a comforting realization, even though it begins as a frightening one. It removes the sense that loss is a peculiar property of antiquity, the misfortune of a less developed era. It restores loss to its proper place, as a constant feature of the human condition present in every age, including this one. The civilizations that came before were not lost because they were primitive. They were lost because being human means existing inside a stream of time that is almost incomprehensibly larger than any single life or any single culture, and which preserves only what happens to be carried into the next moment by whatever fragile thread can bear it. The present civilization is not exempt. It is simply at an earlier stage of its own forgetting. The recognition does something to the proportions of self. It makes the present seem smaller, but in a way that is not humiliating. It makes the present seem more porous, more part of something, less the climax of a long climb and more a particular weather pattern in a sky that has held many such patterns. The peoples who built Göbekli Tepe and then deliberately buried it did not know they were on the way to becoming an archaeological mystery. They were just living, doing what their meanings asked of them, returning the great pillars to the earth for reasons that made sense to them at the time. The peoples who painted the caves of Sulawesi and Chauvet were not creating prehistoric art. They were doing whatever it is one does when the world demands an image. The peoples whose villages now lie beneath the North Sea were not vanished pre-Neolithic populations. They were the entire world to themselves until they were not. The same will be true of the present moment eventually. Whatever this present believes itself to be, whatever it tells itself about its own importance, its own permanence, its own coherence, none of those self-images will be the way later observers, if they exist, will describe it. The buildings that now seem most enduring may, by some future eye, appear the way certain Roman ruins now appear to a modern visitor. Quietly impressive, deeply foreign, embedded in a context whose original meaning is no longer fully available. The languages most powerful today may, in some unimaginable future, exist only as scholarly subjects studied by speakers of tongues not yet born. The events most momentous to the present, the names most familiar to its newspapers, may persist only as fragments quoted by some later historian seeking to reconstruct a vanished world. None of this is morbid. It is only true. What this knowledge does not do, however, is make the search useless. If anything, it gives it a different kind of dignity. To inquire into what came before is not to chase a single lost answer. It is to participate in something the species has been doing since it first became aware of itself, as standing inside time at all. The act of trying to understand the depth of one's own situation. The cave painter who left a handprint on a wall 40,000 years ago, and the modern researcher running thermoluminescence dating on a sediment sample are, in some quiet way, performing related gestures. Both are saying this happened. Both are saying someone was here. Both are saying please remember. The first does so by inscribing pigment on stone. The second does so by inscribing data into peer-reviewed publication. The means are different. The longing is the same. Perhaps that is the deepest thing the search reveals. Not a hidden empire, not a lost technology, not a single missing chapter that would explain everything if only it could be recovered. Rather, a recognition that to be human is to live inside a vast inheritance of attempts, most of which have been lost, and to know oneself as both the inheritor of that loss and the next contributor to it. The civilizations that came before us did not necessarily fail, they simply ended, the way all civilizations have ended, the way this one will end in due course by some mechanism currently invisible. What they left behind was not chosen by them. What they kept of their inner worlds was a matter of accident, of climate, of conquest, of the patience of stone and the impatience of fire. The same is true now. The same will always be true. There is no final image with which such a journey closes. There is no triumphant arrival. There is only, perhaps, a softer way of standing within one's own moment, knowing that beneath the floor on which one stands lie many other floors, that beneath the names one speaks lie many older names, that beneath the present's confidence in its own arrangements lie countless other arrangements, briefly tried and quietly lost. The earth does not narrate these things in straight lines. It holds them, layer upon layer, the way a body holds the years that have passed through it, without being able to describe what each one was. To listen to such a body is not to expect it to speak. It is only to acknowledge that it has lived, and that what is no longer audible is not therefore absent. Somewhere, beneath the soft accumulation of dust and water and root and time, the older versions of human meaning continue their long, quiet rest. They are not waiting to be found. They are simply present as they have always been, indifferent to the question of who is looking. And whoever lies still tonight, listening to a voice describe these things, joins for a moment the long line of those who have wondered the same wonder, not in order to solve it, but in order briefly to keep it alive a little longer, before the night closes again over what was and what may yet have been here before us.